I never thought that stopping to help a stranger would open a door into my own past, but the evening I met that quiet homeless man outside the grocery store is still so clear in my mind that I can almost hear the soft hum of the streetlights and feel the chill in the air pressing into my coat as I stood there unsure of what to say to him, holding a small paper bag of bread I had bought on a simple instinct, not knowing that my life was already stepping onto a path I could never step away from again. He had been sitting near the brick wall with his hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes lowered like he didn't want to be seen, yet something about the calm sadness in his posture pulled at me in a way I couldn't explain, and I remember thinking how strange it is that sometimes we can feel drawn to someone before words are ever spoken, as if our hearts recognize something our minds have not yet caught up to. So I walked over slowly and offered the bag with an unsure smile, saying in a gentle voice, "I thought you might like something warm tonight." And when he looked up, his eyes met mine in a way that made me pause because there was a familiarity there, not in recognition but in feeling, like looking into a photograph you somehow remember without ever having seen before. And he thanked me quietly, his voice low and rough yet kind, and he told me his name was Daniel, and I sat beside him for just a moment even though I had planned to go straight home to make soup and settle into the quiet of my evening routine. Yet something inside me settled down instead when I stayed there, as if listening was more important than any place I was headed to. I learned in those first few minutes almost nothing about him, and yet somehow everything that mattered. That he had been living without a stable home for years, that he tried to keep clean and organized in ways no one noticed, and that he had once had a life full of ordinary things like dinner tables, family voices, and jobs that made him feel useful. And as he spoke, I felt a gentle ache because his words reminded me of how fragile our footing can be, how easily life can slip sideways when we least expect it. And I kept noticing those small similarities that didn't mean anything at the time. The way he folded his hands just like my mother used to when she prayed quietly, the tiny tilt of his head that mirrored how I looked when I concentrated, and even the cadence of his voice that held a softness so recognizable it stirred something in me I tucked away without thinking because surely it was nothing more than coincidence. I brought him tea from the cafe across the street that night, sitting longer than I meant to while the traffic passed and the world kept rushing by, unaware that two strangers were sharing warmth in a quiet bubble of stillness. And when we said goodbye, he squeezed my hand lightly with surprising familiarity and told me, "You have a good heart." Words that stayed with me longer than they should have, trailing into my walk home where the evening air no longer felt cold but strangely comforting, as if the night itself had cradled me with purpose, though I could not name what that purpose was yet. From that night on, I began to notice him whenever I stopped at the store, always sitting in nearly the same spot, always with the same gentle quietness, and I started bringing small offerings, coffee, sandwiches, a scarf when the weather began to cool, without turning it into charity but simply conversation. And each time we talked a little longer than before, and slowly pieces of our lives began to be shared like fragile keepsakes placed carefully between us. He told me about growing up in foster homes, how his memories of family were blurred like photographs left too long in the sun, how he never knew his birth parents but always wondered if somewhere in the world there were people who might think of him without knowing why. And as he said these words, my chest would tighten and my breathing slow because I came from a similar silence, raised by distant relatives who loved me yet never spoke about where I truly came from, leaving my identity like a puzzle box sealed tight with unanswered questions. And while I'd made peace with not knowing long ago, hearing Daniel speak stirred the old wondering again, waking a curiosity I believed I had buried under the responsibilities of adulthood and quiet acceptance. There were moments when our stories overlapped so closely I found myself laughing softly and saying things like, "That sounds just like me," or "I remember feeling that way too," brushing the feelings aside as coincidence, yet I could not shake the sensation that our conversations carried a depth not usually shared between people who barely knew each other, as if some unseen thread was guiding what we said and how easily our words met. Even silence felt comfortable between us, filled not with awkwardness but with understanding that needed no explanation. And in those gentle pauses, I would study the lines of his face without being obvious, noticing how they mirrored the faces in my own memory, the same shaped nose, the same curve of cheekbone, images I dismissed again and again because the idea forming in my mind seemed too unreasonable to entertain. One evening, while we shared soup from mismatched paper cups, he asked me softly, "Do you ever wonder where you truly come from?" And my hands froze mid-motion as if he had spoken a private thought out loud. And after a small pause, I answered honestly, telling him I used to wonder every day when I was younger, but had learned to live without answers. And he nodded slowly like he understood more than I had said, adding, "I think some of us carry invisible ties to people we haven't met yet." And those words echoed inside me so deeply that they followed me home that night, brushing against the door of possibility I had kept firmly shut for decades. Over the weeks that followed, I began to piece together our timelines in idle conversation. Where we were born, what we little remembered of early years, fragments of stories shared by caregivers long gone, and with each coincidence my heart beat a little louder, though I kept smiling calmly and telling myself, similarities do not equal connection, that thousands of lives cross paths every day with no deeper meaning attached to them. Yet late at night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Daniel's voice and expressions and the strange comfort I felt in his presence, sensing something unfinished waiting quietly just below the surface of reason, like a story holding its breath before the truth is spoken aloud.
I tried to dismiss the growing ache of curiosity as nothing more than human compassion mixed with shared loneliness, but as the patterns grew undeniable and the sense of familiarity deepened into something that felt almost ancestral, I began to wonder if destiny sometimes works not with dramatic signs, but with gentle nudges that ask us to notice what has always been stirring close to our hearts. And one evening, as I walked toward the grocery store again with a warm drink in my hands, a question rose so loud inside me that I could no longer push it away. What if helping this man had not been random at all, but the first step towards uncovering a truth meant for both of us?
As that question continued to echo inside me, I tried to quiet it with reason, telling myself that life often arranges gentle meetings without hidden meaning, that not every strong feeling must lead somewhere larger. But each time I saw Daniel sitting near the familiar brick wall, I felt the same subtle pull in my chest, as if an invisible hand were tugging at threads long buried beneath routine and practicality. And the more we spoke, the harder it became to ignore the small details weaving accidental harmony between our lives. Our shared love for old music humming through cracked radios, our oddly matching habits of watching people pass and quietly inventing stories for them, even the way we both avoided talking about childhoods that felt incomplete, speaking instead about the joys of simple survival, the comfort of warm drinks on cold evenings, and that peculiar peace found in small kindnesses. Conversations that felt natural yet oddly weighted with unspoken recognition. One evening, while rain whispered against the awning near where we sat, Daniel smiled softly and said, "Talking to you feels like remembering something I forgot." And the sincerity in his voice tightened something inside me so suddenly, I had to look away for a moment, blinking against a surprising swell of emotion, because I had felt the same unexplainable familiarity, but hadn't dared to say it aloud, fearing the words themselves might make the situation feel strange or foolish. Yet hearing him articulate my own silent thoughts made the moment feel tender rather than awkward, shared rather than solitary. I began paying closer attention, studying the way he spoke about the world, with the same quiet optimism my own mother carried, finding beauty in modest corners and hope even in hardship, and it stirred memories of family stories I had rarely revisited, images stitched together from half-told tales and faded photos, none offering clarity, but all suggesting that something once lost had not disappeared entirely, only slipped quietly from view waiting to be noticed again. The sense of recognition deepened into something both gentle and unsettling as our conversations grew more personal, and I found myself volunteering bits of my own unsettled background, explaining how my origins were always spoken of in vague half-sentences, how documents were missing, details blurred by time or withheld out of protection, and how I learned long ago to treasure the family who raised me, while still carrying unanswered curiosities like folded letters never mailed. And Daniel listened with a kindness that never felt intrusive, saying softly, "Some stories wait until we're ready," words that sat between us like a small lantern glowing uncertainly in the quiet. In the following days, my thoughts became more difficult to contain. I caught myself comparing timelines, calculating ages, noticing how our life patterns curved across decades with uncanny parallels, and the coincidences felt less accidental with each new mental thread woven into the growing tapestry, even as I resisted assigning them meaning out of fear that I was shaping fantasy from coincidence, because the heart, I knew, desperately wants patterns when it yearns for belonging. Yet denying the possibility did little to still the emotional momentum developing between us, and I found myself lying awake at night replaying our exchanges, wondering if caution had long been my armor against disappointment, and whether it now prevented me from stepping towards something truthful unfolding right before me. Eventually, the tension between curiosity and restraint became too heavy to ignore, and one evening, while we stood preparing to part ways beneath softly flickering fluorescent light, I spoke before I could talk myself out of it. "Have you ever felt like our meeting wasn't exactly random?" My voice barely louder than the rustling wind. And Daniel was silent for several breaths, then nodded slowly, eyes reflecting vulnerability more than surprise, answering, "I felt that too, but I didn't want to say it first." A confession that settled between us with both warmth and apprehension, changing the air of our conversations from simple companionship into something heavier with unspoken possibility. The following days unfolded with a heightened awareness between us, neither rushing nor retreating, continuing our gentle meetings yet now layered with shared acknowledgement that our connection may hold more than ordinary coincidence. Still, neither of us pushed toward answers, as if instinctively knowing that such revelations shape lives and require readiness rather than impulse, and I appreciated his patience as deeply as I questioned my own hesitation, sensing our restraint was guided by mutual care rather than fear. There were moments when I nearly voiced the growing theory forming inside me, the uncomfortable yet compelling thought that perhaps our lives connected far beyond chance meetings. But words paused against the careful kindness we had built, and I worried that articulating such speculation too quickly might fracture the fragile peace we shared before truth was ready to emerge naturally. During those uncertain days, I revisited old keepsakes at home, yellowed photos without labels, handwritten notes from relatives long gone, scraps of identity lacking full context, and each artifact felt newly charged with possible meaning, not offering direct answers, but gently reminding me that roots can remain hidden, yet deeply alive beneath the soil of everyday life, waiting for the courage required to begin uncovering them. Through it all, Daniel remained his quiet, gentle self, never pressing for explanations, simply sharing space and warmth,
his presence steady as if he too sensed that our relationship was approaching a threshold neither wished to cross alone or unprepared. And so the emotional weight between us swelled into anticipation as we continued our meetings beside that familiar brick wall under rotating seasons. Each conversation added another layer to the growing sense that whatever story linked our paths had been quietly forming for decades before finally drawing our steps together on that ordinary sidewalk. And with each passing day, the once dismissed notion of destiny began to feel less fanciful and more like a truth approaching softly and steadily, promising to change not only what we thought we knew about each other, but what we believe we understood about ourselves.
Before Daniel entered my life, my days followed a simple, predictable rhythm shaped by years of quiet contentment and careful acceptance, a life built from modest routines that left little room for unexpected turns. And I believed for a long time that comfort came from knowing what would happen tomorrow, waking up in the same small house, making the same cup of weak morning tea, tending to my garden, and spending evenings with books that filled the air with gentle silence rather than unanswered wondering. And although people might call this lonely, it felt peaceful to me because peace, after a childhood full of uncertainty, had become my most precious goal. I grew up with relatives who cared for me deeply, though questions about my early years were met with soft deflections or incomplete stories, spoken as if the truth were fragile glass best left untouched, and I learned quickly not to press for answers because I sensed the protective silence came from love rather than deception. Still, the absence of clear beginnings lingered quietly inside me like a song unfinished, and as I grew into adulthood, I carried this uncertainty as one carries an unasked question, present but no longer painful, folded neatly into daily living where there was much more tangible comfort to focus on. Work kept me busy for decades in steady, unremarkable roles that paid my bills and connected me with ordinary people whose routines mirrored my own, and I found subtle satisfaction in serving simple needs, answering phones, organizing paperwork, helping customers find small solutions, because such tasks stitched me into the fabric of daily human life without demanding emotional complexity. I married young to a kind man whose calm presence mirrored my desire for stability, and though our years together were gentle and respectful, they were quietly childless, leaving space within our home that we filled with companionship, shared work ethic, and weekend rituals that became our language of love. Yet when illness carried him away far too early, I found myself alone again, reshaped by grief, yet steadied by habits that offered structure when my heart felt unmoored. Through those years, I leaned more deeply into solitude and reflection, cultivating a quiet comfort with being by myself as both protection and renewal, believing that longing, while natural, did not always require fulfillment to be meaningful, and that lives can be whole even without complete answers to their earliest mysteries. As time went on, I developed a practice of small kindnesses toward others without attaching expectation to them. Simple gestures like holding doors, listening when strangers spoke, or offering a warm drink to someone cold, believing these tiny bridges between human lives mattered more than grand gestures ever could. And it was from this gentle philosophy that my meeting with Daniel arose, though I hadn't recognized it then as anything more than a moment of compassion directed outward rather than inward. When I think back on those weeks leading up to our connection deepening, I see now how the pieces of my past had quietly prepared me. The patient listening learned from years of self-reflection, the acceptance cultivated by unanswered questions, and the emotional steadiness built from both partnership and loss shaped how I responded to him not as a rescuer or benefactor, but as simply another human navigating difficulty who deserved dignity above all else. I spoke to him without the hurried sympathy people often displayed towards strangers dealing with visible hardship, offering instead the same soft curiosity and respect I extended to anyone else I met, asking about his preferences, his interests, the small joys that still colored his days, and it surprised me how easily he shared when approached without judgment, responding not with rehearsed gratitude but with genuine openness that soon drew me deeper into his quiet world. Daniel told me about the simple comforts he sought: shelter from rain, books collected from donation bins, music he could play softly through worn headphones, and as we compared preferences and habits, I noticed how alike our emotional languages were, both of us valuing subtle pleasures over grand ambitions, suggesting to me that connection often arises not from similar circumstances, but from shared temperament. Meanwhile, fragments of his early story lingered in my thoughts longer than I expected they would. The foster homes, the blurred childhood images, the unanswered questions mirrored my own hidden beginnings too closely to ignore. But I continued dismissing deeper implications, telling myself that shared longing for origin is common among many people and need not imply direct connection, despite the unsettled feeling that followed me home from each conversation like a quiet shadow. I became more curious about family stories in general, revisiting memories of relatives' conversations from decades earlier, replaying remarks that once seemed meaningless, comments about lost relatives, whispered regrets, temporal gaps that I previously assumed belonged to the distant adult world, and now viewed through the lens of present curiosity began to form possibilities my younger mind never had the tools or courage to shape. Yet I remained cautious not to rush interpretations, reminding myself that the emotional resonance of coincidence often magnifies patterns before truth solidifies. During one of our longer conversations, Daniel described recurring dreams of sitting across from someone he could never quite see clearly, only feeling comfort and calm radiating between them. And when he shared this, I felt an odd stirring of familiarity, not because I recognized the dream itself, but because I too had always dreamed of sitting with someone in wordless understanding, a presence comforting enough that even silence felt full. And we quietly laughed at how parallel our subconscious imagery seemed without dwelling on its meaning aloud. In those moments, I sensed more fully how companionship can echo intimacy even in its earliest stages, built not from dramatic confession but from steady emotional safety that allows pieces of ourselves to surface gently. And that safety perhaps drew me closer to confronting the curiosity I had long folded away. At home, the objects of my modest life, framed photographs, weathered furniture,
furniture, boxes of letters, began beckoning me toward reflection, not out of sadness but intrigue, as if memory itself were urging me to look backward with new eyes. And I noticed a growing readiness inside me, a soft confidence that perhaps the time had finally come to revisit roots rather than continue quietly stepping around them. Though I told no one about the swirl of questions forming in my mind, keeping those thoughts carefully tucked behind polite smiles and everyday conversation, I privately prepared myself for the possibility that answers, whenever they arrived, might complicate the peaceful narrative I had long built for myself. Yet I also sensed that complexity need not shatter serenity, but could deepen it when met with acceptance rather than resistance. The idea that my present life might still hold unresolved chapters from a distant past no longer frightened me as it once would have. Instead, it stirred a gentle anticipation, a readiness to listen to whatever truths surfaced without demanding immediate clarity or resolution. And as my meetings with Daniel continued beneath steady skies and passing seasons, I felt myself shifting from observer to participant in a story unfolding not through urgency, but through quiet emotional momentum guiding us towards revelations neither of us yet fully understood.
As my days continued to intersect with Daniel's gentle presence, the quiet structure of my life began to open outward in ways I had never truly anticipated, not with disruption or upheaval, but with a subtle stretching of emotional space that made room for deeper curiosity and unexpected tenderness. And I noticed how I now looked forward to our conversations not simply because I enjoyed helping another human being, but because sitting beside him felt like returning to a familiar place I could not name, a comfort that went beyond ordinary kindness and settled somewhere close to the core of my being. We began meeting more intentionally, arranging our walks together along the small park path just beyond the grocery store where benches were shaded by aging trees whose leaves whispered softly above us, and in those moments away from street noise we spoke more freely, sharing thoughts about aging, purpose, regret, and gratitude, topics that emerge naturally only when people feel safe enough to be seen. And I sensed in his voice the same blend of resilience and longing I recognized in myself, a quiet hope that life still held meaning beyond survival alone. He spoke about small dreams left unfulfilled, learning to paint, owning a simple home someday, reconnecting with something that felt like belonging, and though I offered encouragement, I often found myself absorbing his words inwardly, as if they were reflections of my own untended wishes, realizing that vulnerability invites connection precisely because it strips away pretense, leaving only shared humanity beneath. Our conversations grew less guarded, stories flowed not in neat sequences but in overlapping fragments, sometimes jumping years or circling around memories hesitantly touched yet never fully revealed. And I came to understand that both of us carried histories with missing pieces, gaps we had learned to navigate rather than fill, but which now stirred gently toward exploration under the warmth of companionship. Occasionally, I would sense the weight behind his pauses, words withheld not from secrecy but caution, and I mirrored that restraint with my own careful hesitation, recognizing that trust grows not from demanding full disclosure, but from allowing stories to unfold naturally, at a pace shaped by mutual emotional readiness rather than curiosity alone. As the weeks stretched into months, familiarity deepened into something steadier, a shared rhythm where listening felt as meaningful as speaking, and I noticed how Daniel's presence altered my internal dialogues, how my long-accepted quiet independence softened into a subtle openness toward emotional interdependence, the recognition that togetherness need not diminish strength but can enhance it, offering courage without coercion, companionship without obligation. Still, despite growing closeness, an unspoken boundary lingered between us, a mutual reluctance to articulate the curious patterns threading our stories, ages aligning with loose timelines from my childhood recollections, geographic overlaps too precise to ignore, and physical similarities that surfaced increasingly clearly as trust used casual observation. Yet neither of us raised these coincidences directly, perhaps intuitively understanding that some truths must mature before they can be faced without fear or destabilization. During this period of suspended questioning, I returned increasingly to memory, revisiting stories shared by elderly relatives who had passed long ago, recalling overheard discussions about family transitions, relocations, and difficult chapters spoken in vague language when children lingered near adult conversations. And as I pieced together these fragments, I felt the emotional terrain inside me shift from passive acceptance into gentle inquiry, driven less by need for explanation and more by a deepened desire for wholeness. I spent afternoons organizing the boxes left untouched for years, artifacts from different phases of my life that now felt newly significant, sorting letters, photographs without names, documents missing full context, and as I worked, I found myself emotionally preparing for truths I could not yet define, but already sensed would emerge, though I was careful to ground my heart with patience rather than expectation, reminding myself that even revelations born from kindness must be embraced thoughtfully. My meetings with Daniel became spaces of mutual emotional grounding rather than solely acts of support, moments where we both seemed to reap calm and reassurance simply by sitting quietly together, sometimes watching birds gather near the park benches or listening to passing conversations, content to share silence without urgency. And in this quiet companionship, I discovered a new sense of presence, not self-contained solitude but peaceful togetherness, something I had not experienced since my husband's passing yet did not resemble romantic love at all, instead settling into a warmth closer to familial comfort, instinctively safe and enduring. There were days when Daniel would express appreciation with surprising emotional depth, saying things like, "Talking to you helps me feel real again," and while I answered with encouragement, those words stirred reflections inside me about how connection restores identity not through validation but through recognition, seeing ourselves mirrored gently in another person who listens without judgment.
Though emotional closeness deepened, fear still flickered quietly within me. Fear not of the man beside me, but of what answers might mean if curiosity transformed into certainty, how revelations could reshape identities long settled, disturb relationships built on fragile harmony, or introduce complexities demanding emotional courage beyond comfort. Yet alongside fear grew the recognition that avoiding truth cannot preserve peace indefinitely, and that some emotional stillness only comes from acceptance rather than ignorance. I began sensing that our narratives were converging towards an unseen juncture waiting ahead, a moment when coincidence might clarify into connection. And while I did not yet speak this awareness aloud, I noticed how both Daniel and I subtly prepared emotionally through reflection, our conversations touching more frequently on themes of acceptance, forgiveness, and the idea that understanding rarely damages love, but reinforces its foundation through honesty. By the end of that season, I recognized a pivotal internal shift. I no longer felt content merely living quietly around unresolved origins. I felt prepared to confront the unknown with emotional steadiness shaped by lived experience and compassionate connection. And I sensed that whatever truths awaited beyond our comfortable silence, I was no longer approaching them alone, but beside another human being equally poised at the edge of discovery. And though neither Daniel nor I had yet articulated the possibility quietly guiding us forward, the unspoken realization hovered between us like a held breath, that our meeting was not simply a coincidence of kindness, but the opening chapter of a story destined to uncover deeper ties than either of us had once imagined, gently carrying us towards revelations that would reshape our understanding of family, belonging, and the mysterious pathways through which compassion leads us home.
As the quiet certainty grew that Daniel and I were standing on the edge of something far deeper than an ordinary friendship, my once peaceful routines began to feel unsettled, not from fear, but from the tension between what I sensed and what I dared to admit, and I moved through each day carrying a gentle heaviness that followed me like a soft shadow, even while I continued watering my garden, shopping for groceries, and practicing the calm disciplines I had relied on for years to settle emotions that lingered unsaid. Each meeting with him now carried layered meaning. Our conversation still drifted through small comforts, favorite meals, memories of music from younger days, moments of gratitude found in simple survival. But beneath the surface lay an awareness we both felt, yet still avoided speaking, as though naming it might fracture the delicate emotional peace we had built, or demand answers neither of us felt prepared to face. I noticed my thoughts cycling more persistently toward our similarities, the parallels of age alignment within our fragmented recollections, the matching gestures and facial expressions that revealed themselves casually when we shared laughter, the peculiar alignment of past locations that overlapped far too frequently to remain explainable as coincidence. And yet each time these details assembled themselves toward meaning, I gently dismantled them with rational explanations, reminding myself that the human heart instinctively seeks patterns when yearning is present, shaping connection from familiarity rather than destiny. Still, doubt slowly replaced certainty inside me, not disbelief in our connection, but uncertainty about whether continuing to avoid the piercing questions truly protected us emotionally or merely delayed an eventual reckoning that could prove more painful the longer it remained suspended. During our walks through the park, silence began to stretch longer between exchanges, not uncomfortable, yet heavier with contemplation, and I would watch Daniel study the ducks near the old pond with a distant gaze that mirrored my own faraway thoughts, sensing we were both grappling privately with the same emotional weight we carefully pretended not to share aloud. Occasionally, he would begin a sentence only to stop himself, lips parting then closing as if unsure whether to proceed, and those moments ache now in hindsight, because I too held questions on the tip of my tongue, unwilling to let them fall for fear of changing our fragile tether before I fully trusted its resilience. I returned often to reflection through writing in an old notebook, mapping loose timelines and memories like a child trying to connect constellations across a vast unknown sky. The few dates my guardians had shared about my early years, the relocation records I vaguely recalled overhearing, the scattered stories Daniel had offered about his own childhood placements and transitions, and as I laid these fragments side by side, the overlaps grew difficult to ignore. Same years, same regional movements, same invisible gaps where documentation dissolved, forming a fragile narrative skeleton trembling with implication, yet requiring emotional bravery before flesh could be placed upon it. Fear emerged not in sharp waves but gentle swells, steady and persistent, as I contemplated how potential truths could reshape the foundation of identity upon which I had built a stable emotional life. After decades of learning to live with incomplete origins, I worried that clarity might unsettle the peaceful acceptance I had cultivated so carefully, ushering complexity where calm once stood, not because I feared truth itself, but because I feared the emotional turbulence that accompanies any redefinition of self. Meanwhile, Daniel's own vulnerability deepened subtly, revealing through small cracks in composure an increasing emotional tremor beneath his calm, as though he too were approaching revelations he feared could either heal old wounds or widen them. And in moments when he spoke of belonging, home, and the ache of invisibility, I sensed the fragility beneath his resilience, prompting me to strengthen my emotional presence with extra gentleness rather than risk burdensome curiosity.
The strain of unspoken questions manifested physically for me: restless sleep, an oddly persistent tightness in my chest during conversations, an uncharacteristic hesitation that interrupted otherwise natural speech. Signs my inner voice recognized as emotional conflict demanding resolution. Yet patience continued to restrain me, counseling kindness to both myself and Daniel, while urging discernment over impulsivity. One quiet afternoon where autumn breezes scattered leaves across the park path, Daniel finally broke the comfortable pattern of surface conversation and said softly, "I feel like there's something important we're not talking about," his tone gentle yet weighted with sincerity, and I felt my pulse quicken at his bravery, yet my response faltered as conflicting instincts pulled me in different directions, to protect the safety we had built and to honor the truth trembling between us. So I answered cautiously, "Some things feel hard to put into words," and though he nodded with understanding, I sensed disappointment flicker momentarily in his eyes before he smoothed it back beneath calm acceptance. That near confession lingered between us afterward like an unresolved melody, altering the emotional texture of our meetings. Heavier, more tentative, and I noticed myself measuring every sentence afterward, unconsciously guarding speech as if precision might preserve equilibrium. Yet silence too now carried an edge, brimming with deferred questions that refused to dissolve. I began to sense how emotional avoidance, even when motivated by compassion, can itself generate a quiet form of strain, subtly tense and exhausting, as holding back truth demands constant vigilance that drains the spirit over time, and I wondered how long our mutual restraint could persist before gravity drew us inevitably toward confrontation with the deeper story unfolding beneath our bond. Increasingly, the emotional discrepancies became hard to ignore. Daniel's longing for answers seemed to sharpen each week, while my own hesitation tempered the pace of discovery, and I wrestled silently with guilt over whether my restraint inadvertently prevented him from confronting truths that might offer healing rather than harm. The tipping point inside me emerged not through dramatic argument, but quiet exhaustion, the dawning clarity that emotional safety does not come from perpetual silence, but from facing vulnerabilities with care and courage. And I began to recognize that postponing truth may spare immediate discomfort, but denies the possibility of deeper peace. Night after night, I lay awake thinking of Daniel's unfinished sentences and the vulnerability threading his cautious words, and I knew that continuing to maintain gentle avoidance risked allowing curiosity to mutate into unspoken fear, eroding the fragile trust our companionship depended upon. And yet, even as I prepared emotionally for an honest conversation, I resolved that whatever truths awaited must unfold slowly, with kindness guiding each step, not as an interrogation, but as a mutual exploration honoring the years both of us had lived without answers. Because the fragile bridge we had built could only carry the weight of discovery if compassion remained stronger than anxiety, and I believed, though uncertainty lingered, our shared humanity provided a stable foundation upon which even the most profound revelations could rest without collapsing what mattered most between us.
After that near confession lingered unfinished between us, the emotional distance grew more noticeable, not in space but in tone, and each meeting began to carry a fragile expectancy, as if one misplaced word could tip us into impossible conversation or brittle silence. So I learned to speak slowly and deliberately, measuring every phrase for safety while Daniel mirrored my restraint with his own careful gentleness, and the quiet tension that formed became its own presence, walking beside us as we strolled the park paths and sat on the benches with our coats drawn close against the evening chill. I found myself studying him when he wasn't looking, the tilt of his head when he listened, the texture of his voice when emotion brushed its edges, the subtle way his expressions mirrored ones I recognized from old photographs of relatives long gone, and although I reprimanded myself for turning observation into analysis, the parallels continued to stir uneasily within me, assembling patterns too consistent to dismiss no matter how firmly I urged logic to lead. I revisited memories long sealed inside careful compartments, the childhood stories relayed only in fragments by my guardians, the vague movements across towns I pieced together from scattered remarks, the years where documentation blurred into quiet absence. And when I layered these recollections beside what Daniel had casually shared of his own early back and forth between care homes and brief placements, the echoes felt too aligned to ignore, pressing upon me with a slow, intensifying urgency that even meditation and journal reflection could no longer soothe. Yet fear resurfaced with its gentle restraint, whispering that discovering too much could unfold consequences beyond emotional disruption. What if clarity unraveled identities we had stitched together with hardship and resolve, reshaping not only how we viewed ourselves, but also how the fragile comfort of our companionship might endure, a bond already delicately balanced upon shared solace rather than certainty? Daniel's vulnerability became harder to overlook as he began asking broader questions that circled unspoken themes without directly confronting them. "Do you ever wish you had known more about where you came from?" he once asked quietly while watching children play near the swings,
And though I answered honestly that curiosity existed alongside peace, the guardedness of my reply caused him to nod without further inquiry, retreating back into measured contemplation that mirrored my own cautious silence. Over time, emotional strain began imprinting itself more clearly upon him, appearing in restless movements, brief pauses before speech, and rare moments of visible overwhelm when he would brush emotion aside quickly with a gentle shake of his head and a soft laugh meant to disguise the deeper waters beneath. Witnessing that internal struggle shifted something inside me, awakening protective concern stronger than apprehension, and I began to see my silence less as shielding and more as withholding, a realization that stirred quiet remorse. One afternoon, heavy rain trapped us beneath the shelter of a bus stop, the steady rhythm of falling water enclosing us in a cocoon of sound that dissolved our usual conversational distractions. And as we stood side by side watching puddles ripple across the pavement, Daniel finally faced me directly and said, with unmistakable vulnerability, "I feel like the answers I've been missing might be closer than I realize." And though he did not specify what answers or why I might be connected to them, the emotional weight beneath his words landed unmistakably, tightening my chest with recognition that there was no turning further away without consequence. My heartbeat thundered louder than the rain as I responded with honesty, tempered by gentleness, telling him that sometimes people come into our lives not to bring immediate answers, but to remind us we are not alone while we search. And though he offered a faint smile in reply, the disappointment behind it remained palpable, signaling he had hoped for more direct reassurance than I could bring myself to provide. That exchange haunted me afterward, the missed chance to speak plainly, the compassionate impulse that yet again chose delay over clarity, and I began waking from sleep troubled by dreams where corridors stretched endlessly without doors, embodying the emotional paralysis that gripped me while truth waited on the other side of courage. Slowly, the tension reshaped the nature of our companionship. Laughter grew more subdued, conversations drifted toward philosophical musings rather than memories, and though our emotional connection remained warm, it was overlaid with an unspoken urgency neither of us explicitly voiced, but both unquestionably felt, creating an undercurrent of restrained yearning for clarification that walked beneath every moment we shared. I finally came to understand that love expressed through silence can become a subtle burden rather than comfort, as withholding truth, even gently, risks positioning oneself as gatekeeper to another's healing, a moral weight I hadn't anticipated when choosing caution in place of openness, and that awareness grew heavier the more I noticed Daniel's increasingly withdrawn demeanor in the wake of our restrained exchanges. One evening as the sun dipped below distant rooftops, painting the sky with soft amber light, we sat once more on our familiar park bench, and Daniel spoke with an uncharacteristically firm steadiness, saying, "Whatever the truth is that we're circling, I think I'm ready to face it." And in that moment I felt the threshold inside me shift, the prolonged internal debate quieted into clarity, replaced by the aching realization that courage delayed becomes courage denied, and that love's truest tenderness sometimes expresses itself not through protection from discomfort, but through accompaniment into uncertain discovery. I met his gaze and nodded slowly, understanding that although I still carried fear, the greater risk now lay in withholding the possibility of resolution, and for the first time I allowed myself to prepare emotionally for what awaited, not with definitive knowledge, but with a promise to meet truth openly alongside him when next the opportunity arose, because the path forward, however shattering or healing it proved to be, could no longer be walked in partial light. And as we rose from the bench and headed toward the evening's dimming horizon, I sensed the heavy quiet between us begin to transform, no longer stagnant restraint, but the poised silence that precedes meaningful change, signaling that the emotional tension binding our hearts had finally evolved into readiness for the revelation waiting just beyond the dawn of our next honest conversation.
I spent the days following our benchside promise, moving through ordinary motions as though I were balancing a fragile glass of water that might spill if I stepped too quickly. Every small task, washing dishes, folding laundry, watering the garden, taking on a strange alertness, because beneath each movement lived the awareness that something in my life was shifting toward its inevitable unveiling, and I felt both ready and afraid in equal measure. When Daniel called to ask if we could meet and talk somewhere quiet, the calm steadiness in his voice carried a seriousness that made my chest tighten, yet I agreed immediately, sensing that postponement would only deepen what already pressed so urgently for release. We chose a modest cafe tucked away on a side street, a place with warm lighting, slow music, and enough gentle noise to provide privacy within anonymity. And when I arrived early, I sat with my hands wrapped around an untouched cup, breathing deeply as I reviewed the emotional resolve I had worked so carefully to build, reminding myself that truth shared with compassion rarely destroys connection even when it alters form. Daniel entered with that familiar, gentle manner, but the tension behind his eyes revealed that he had rehearsed this meeting internally as thoroughly as I had, and after initial pleasantries faded into silence, he finally leaned forward and said softly, I'm tired of wondering, a simple sentence laden with years of unspoken longing that settled upon my heart like unexpected weight. I nodded, suddenly conscious of how much emotional power small words can hold, and told him I felt the same, that questions had lived quietly within me too, gathering persistence the longer we avoided voicing them, and as we spoke openly at last, our conversation unfolded not with accusation or urgency but shared vulnerability, two individuals standing at the edge of deeply personal unknowns seeking steadiness in one another's presence rather than certainty itself. Daniel explained the restlessness he had felt since meeting me, the sensations of recognition he couldn't rationalize, the intense pull toward unanswered origins that intensified the longer our companionship endured. And as he described those emotions, tears shimmered briefly in his eyes, revealing a depth of longing I wished I had acknowledged sooner instead of sheltering behind caution. I admitted in response that I too had sensed something unusual from our earliest encounter, not yet meaning, but a familiarity that defied logical explanation, and that as similarities accumulated across our stories and mannerisms, my internal awareness had grown louder even while I silenced it outwardly to protect both of us from emotional overwhelm before we felt ready to face potential truths. The honesty between us felt at first shaky, like ankles finding balance on uncertain ground, and yet with each sentence exchanged, steadiness returned in incremental measures, until the emotional barrier that had hovered invisibly for weeks finally dissolved, replaced by a muted but profound connection shaped by mutual trust. As we continued sharing pieces of our past more freely, names half remembered, places tied to emotional significance rather than geography, periods of absence in official knowledge, the overlapping fragments grew increasingly impossible to dismiss, forming a narrative that hovered just beyond definitive clarity but charged with implications so strong it seemed to hum in the quiet space between our words. I felt my pulse drum steadily as I recognized the conversation pivoting from emotional preparation toward potential revelation, and although no concrete answers yet manifested, the acknowledgement alone ignited something transformative, the realization that whatever truth might eventually emerge, our bond had already shifted from companionship built on kindness into partnership forged through shared bravery. What surprised me most was the calm that followed our admissions. I had feared raw emotional outpouring or destabilization, yet instead a soft serenity settled over both of us, as if verbalizing the unspoken relieved the psychic tension that had silently burdened our interactions, allowing space at last for restful authenticity. Daniel remarked quietly, "Just saying it out loud makes things easier to carry," and I knew with sudden clarity that emotional honesty does not accelerate pain but distributes its weight more evenly, transforming loneliness into feasible companionship. Our discussion gradually turned toward practical considerations, whether to explore documented pathways of understanding, how to emotionally brace for potential revelations without assuming narratives prematurely, and while we treaded carefully around specifics, we agreed on the value of proceeding thoughtfully rather than impulsively, honoring the delicate nature of both our histories and emotional well-being. As the cafe lights dimmed for evening shift change and the gentle hum of conversation grew around us, I experienced an almost surreal awareness that a threshold had been crossed, not through dramatic confrontation, but through courageous gentleness, marking the turning point where quiet suspicion gave way to open intention, where avoidance ceded to trust, and where two individuals who once met as strangers now stood side by side, prepared to walk forward into emotional discovery with compassion as their guiding compass. Leaving the cafe together, our steps matched unconsciously, and although the weight of upcoming unknowns remained present, it felt lighter now that it was no longer borne alone, and I understood that transformation seldom announces itself with thunder or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives simply in the shared decision to look truth in the eye without flinching. Confident that whatever form it takes, the heart fortified by honesty remains capable of enduring both healing and upheaval with quiet grace.
In the days that followed our cafe conversation, I moved with an unfamiliar blend of calm and anticipation, feeling as though I had stepped onto a bridge suspended between the life I understood and the one quietly assembling ahead. And although no new facts have yet emerged, something fundamental within me had shifted, the internal permission to seek clarity openly without fear of what answers might carry. Daniel and I decided to continue our conversations slowly, meeting each weekend in chosen places that felt safe and unhurried. And with every exchange, we ventured deeper into personal memories, revisiting childhood fragments long buried beneath practicality and survival, sharing moments that had once seemed insignificant yet now glowed with the potential relevance of hidden connection. I described the transitional homes I vaguely recalled moving between, the lost keepsakes that once tethered me faintly to people I could no longer name, and the persistent sensation throughout youth that pieces of my story remained missing, while Daniel mirrored these confessions with uncanny symmetry of experience, different specifics, same emotional shape, and as we listened with growing attentiveness, a quiet recognition unfolded that our narratives appeared braided from the same emotional threads despite having developed in isolation. The emotional closeness created by such vulnerability deepened our bond quickly but gently, drawing us into a space of mutual caretaking where curiosity was consistently paired with patience, reminding ourselves repeatedly that the journey mattered as much as any destination awaiting discovery. As our conversations grew more honest, so too did awareness of the tremendous emotional stakes involved, because the outcomes we considered extended far beyond abstract clarity into tangible redefinitions of identity, belonging, and self-perception. And I found myself practicing mental surrender to all possibilities, learning to envision peace regardless of resolution, yet allowing myself to hope for meaningful understanding without clinging to particular outcomes. Daniel was especially open about how unresolved questions had shaped his adult years, subtly influencing relationships and personal confidence. And as he spoke of feeling directionless at times without fully understanding why, I recognized mirrored moments of uncertainty within my own life that now seemed less like individual shortcomings and more like echoes of unanswered origins quietly tugging from beneath the surface. Yet despite the emotional gravity of our discussions, neither of us succumbed to despair, because courage emerged not from certainty but companionship. Being able to face vulnerability together created an unexpected source of steadiness that anchored each unfolding realization, allowing emotional exploration without feelings of isolation. One evening, as twilight settled over the small park near my home, we sat beneath a maple tree whose fading leaves drifted quietly around us, and I shared a previously undisclosed memory. An elderly woman who once called me by a name I did not recognize, pressing a small fabric pouch into my childhood hands before disappearing from my life without explanation, a moment that had haunted me for decades yet remained too painful and confusing to unpack aloud until now. Daniel listened intently, and after a long silence he told me he carried a parallel memory, a woman who once whispered promises over his hospital bed before vanishing. And although neither of us claimed interpretation of these echoes, the emotional symmetry further solidified our realization that hidden chapters once concealed from us were beginning to surface with startling resonance. Despite this mounting awareness, our emotional approach did not accelerate into urgency. Instead, a deeper gentleness prevailed, allowing contemplation alongside curiosity, so the experience could remain integrative rather than overwhelming, reminding us both that pacing protects the heart as much as purpose propels it forward. Gradually, discussions evolved toward the practical: how to navigate long-sealed records, the patience required for bureaucratic pathways, the emotional safeguards needed when seeking truth held silent for decades. And we promised to support one another fully as the wheels of inquiry slowly turned, neither seeking to rush outcome, but acknowledging the comfort in moving forward united. What surprised me most was not fear or regret, but gratitude. Gratitude that even amid ambiguity, I had found someone who understood the ache of unanswered identity and was willing to walk beside me without judgment or expectation, transforming what could have been a solitary struggle into a shared pursuit of clarity. We spoke candidly about emotional boundaries, maintaining individual grounding regardless of what we uncovered, and how we would continue cultivating the companionship that had become foundational, even if eventual truths altered its nature, anchoring ourselves to the understanding that relationships built on care transcend shifting definitions of connection. The culmination of our turning point did not occur through singular revelatory moment, but through evolving emotional readiness itself. A steady internal declaration that whatever unfolded, we no longer feared being alone with its consequences, and that realization reframed everything. Uncertainty became exploration rather than anxiety, and curiosity softened into reverent attentiveness toward the unfolding story of our lives. When we ended that evening's conversation imparted beneath the dim glow of street lamps, there were no dramatic hugs or tearful vows, only a gentle exchange of steady smiles that carried unspoken depth, signifying the crossing of an invisible threshold from emotional stasis into courageous momentum. Walking home, I felt a quiet strength rising from within that I had not known before, the awareness that transformation sometimes announces itself not through dramatic revelation, but through the calm acceptance that truth, however complex, belongs not to one heart alone, but to all those brave enough to face it together, guided by compassion rather than fear.
After Daniel and I stepped fully into our shared commitment to pursue clarity together, the emotional atmosphere of our lives shifted from suspended anticipation into purposeful gentleness, as the long-held breath had finally been released. And even without concrete answers yet unfolding, a subtle peace began blooming inside me. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of honest motion toward understanding. Our communication deepened into a steady rhythm built on emotional check-ins as much as memory sharing, where we learned to balance vulnerability with grounding, ensuring that introspection remained nourishing rather than destabilizing. And I came to cherish our conversations not for the mysteries they chased, but for the compassionate listening they offered, reminding me that connection itself can be healing, even apart from revelation. Small breakthroughs occurred not as dramatic discoveries, but through emotional validations, recognizing why certain fears had shadowed my adult years, understanding how the absence of early belonging shaped my independence, and reframing self-doubt as the echo of omission rather than inadequacy, truths that emerged gently as Daniel lent voice to reflections that mirrored my own. In turn, I offered him the supportive acknowledgement he had rarely known, simply sitting with his uncertainties without attempting to fix them, teaching us both that companionship flourishes not in problem-solving but presence, where acceptance nurtures courage just as freely as answers ever could. As paperwork and archival inquiry slowly progressed, tedious, often ambiguous, the emotional journey became our real transformation, enabling us to uncouple identity from documentation and anchor self-worth not in lineage information, but lived purpose, kindness extended, resilience practiced, and grace cultivated through endurance. I began revisiting childhood memories with softer compassion rather than analytical urgency, viewing each fragment as a testament to survival rather than a clue demanding dissection. And this reframing allowed old pain to transform into gratitude for the strength forged amid uncertainty. Paradoxically, seeking truth expanded rather than narrowed my emotional horizons, as exploring origins clarified the fullness of life already lived without complete knowledge, illuminating that missing answers never diminished authenticity, they merely left portions of story unwritten until readiness arrived. Daniel experienced similar emotional shifts. He became visibly lighter as we honored curiosity without attaching desperation to its outcomes, finding new confidence in carving present meaning unburdened by incomplete pasts, and our partnership matured into one defined by emotional steadiness instead of inquiry alone. We established rituals grounded in mutual care, quiet tea evenings, reflective walks, shared meals where silence remained as cherished as speech, building sanctuary for reflection while anchored by the comforting constancy of routine. And through these everyday practices, emotional healing unfolded quietly, requiring no ceremony beyond sustained kindness.
In moments when apprehension resurfaced, we gently redirected one another toward grounding reaffirmations. We're safe now. We're allowed to take this slowly. Our value isn't defined by what we discover. And these simple sentences became emotional anchors, tethering us when uncertainty's tide tried to pull us into worry. I took notice of how my sleep grew deeper, how the habitual tightness in my chest dissipated, how moments of laughter returned uninhibited, and these bodily cues testified to an internal settling that could not be traced to any factual resolution, but only the profound relief that honesty brings. And perhaps the most transformative realization unfolded when I recognized that the search for origin had ceased to be about fixing a missing narrative and had become an act of self-honor, choosing to know myself fully even if knowing might be complicated, and trusting that I possessed the resilience to integrate whatever truths awaited without fracturing emotional wholeness. During one particularly tender conversation, Daniel said softly, "I think what matters most is that we didn't have to walk this alone." And the truth of his words resonated deeply, crystallizing the heart of our resolution. Not that answers had been found, but that the loneliness we once carried had been replaced by companionship rooted in patience and respect. Moving forward thus felt less like advancing into uncertainty and more like settling into emotional completeness, regardless of outcome, because the partnership forged through vulnerability had already healed spaces in both our hearts that information alone never could have reached. With each passing day, I grew more convinced that truth pursued with compassion bears not the weight of upheaval, but the promise of gentle transformation, shaping self-understanding through acceptance rather than disruption. And whether discovery brought clarity or continued mystery, Daniel and I had already claimed the most vital outcome, the freedom to seek without fear and to rest in the knowledge that belonging can be built to a human connection as authentically as it is inherited.
As weeks turned into months, the quiet rhythm of shared discovery continued to shape our lives, and Daniel and I learned to honor both the unfolding mysteries and the certainties of our companionship, recognizing that emotional stability arises not from answers alone, but from the consistent presence of care and mutual respect, which we nurture daily through simple gestures, shared coffee, attentive listening, and the comfort of unhurried conversation. I found myself reflecting on the old fear I had carried, the instinct to shield from emotional disruption, and marveled at how unnecessary that fear had been when vulnerability is met with patience rather than judgment, realizing that withholding truth had never truly protected us, only delayed the healing that honesty invites. Our lives intertwined in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. I noticed the subtle patterns of behavior that mirrored my own long-lost habits, small laughs and gestures that echoed familiarity, and moments when our shared histories, though still partially unknown, resonated like harmonies in a song we were learning to play together. As I continued to journal and revisit memories, I did so with gentleness and acceptance, recognizing that even incomplete stories contain profound meaning, and I celebrated the resilience both Daniel and I had cultivated through years of uncertainty, realizing that our shared courage and emotional openness had become the foundation upon which a fuller life could be constructed. There were moments of tension, of course, when a question arose or a memory resurfaced unexpectedly, but these no longer felt threatening. We approached them with patience, acknowledging feelings as valid and letting answers emerge in their own time, creating a balance between curiosity and emotional safety that allowed trust to deepen steadily. Over time, the sense of mystery surrounding our pasts became less a source of anxiety and more a gentle backdrop against which our connection flourished, teaching me that fulfillment is often found not in complete knowledge, but in the security of companionship and the willingness to face life's uncertainties together. I watched Daniel grow, more relaxed, more present, and more at ease with the unknown, and I felt the same within myself, recognizing that life's greatest lessons often arrive not through revelations, but through the grace of shared experience, the patience of waiting, and the courage to hold space for one another's vulnerabilities. There were days when the past would press softly against the edges of thought, yet rather than fear, these moments were met with reflection and gratitude for the journey we had undertaken together, and I realized that the emotional growth we experienced was itself a treasure, more enduring than any specific answers we might uncover. We began planning small activities together that celebrated the present rather than chasing clarity alone. Walks along familiar streets, cooking simple meals side by side, quiet evenings of reading and conversation, and in these ordinary routines, I discovered extraordinary contentment, proof that emotional connection thrives in the small, consistent acts of care. I found myself laughing more freely, resting more deeply, and approaching each day with a calm heart, buoyed by the certainty that whatever truths lay hidden or revealed, we were moving through them with patience, understanding, and love. In quiet reflection, I understood that the resolution we sought was never solely about discovering origins, but about embracing each other's presence fully, nurturing a bond strong enough to hold uncertainty and gentle enough to allow growth. And in that awareness, I felt an enduring peace settle within, like a soft, unbroken rhythm beneath the pulse of life. The emotional journey, from suspicion to hesitation, to tentative confession to shared exploration, had transformed us, showing that courage is cultivated not only by confronting facts, but by meeting each other with empathy and trust, and that the heart's true resilience is revealed in its ability to accept both mystery and clarity with equal grace. And so, in the quiet that followed months of exploration, Daniel and I moved forward together, grounded, patient, and connected, carrying the lessons of our shared journey not as burdens, but as the tender living proof that human connection, honesty, and compassion can illuminate the path even when history remains incomplete, leaving space for love, understanding, and hope to flourish fully within our hearts. As time gently flowed onward, the extraordinary yet quiet transformation that Daniel and I had nurtured settled into the rhythm of everyday life, and I came to understand that endings are rarely dramatic moments of revelation. Instead, they are soft transitions that allow reflection, gratitude, and calm acceptance to take root. Our shared journey had taught me that the heart is resilient, not because it avoids pain, but because it learns to carry it alongside joy, curiosity, and compassion, embracing uncertainty as a companion rather than an adversary. I often sat quietly in my favorite armchair, watching sunlight spill across the wooden floors, thinking of the path that had led us here, the tentative conversations, the careful disclosures, the fears that had once held me rigid. And I felt a deep appreciation for the courage it took simply to stay present with one another through all the unknowns. Daniel would occasionally place his hand over mine during these moments, a simple gesture that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of trust and companionship forged through vulnerability. In the evenings, we walked slowly through the neighborhood, noticing small details, the way leaves rustled under the wind, the soft chatter of neighbors, the comforting routine of familiar streets, and each mundane observation now carried a subtle beauty that had once gone unnoticed, illuminated by the shared experience of navigating life's uncertainties together. I reflected on the lessons that had emerged, that patience cultivates understanding, that honesty nurtures connection, that compassion can soften fear, and that sometimes the journey toward truth is as vital as truth itself. My relationship with myself had also deepened. I no longer sought validation from outcomes or answers, but from the quiet acknowledgement that I had acted with integrity, courage, and kindness, and that the emotional growth I experienced could not be diminished by any unknowns that remained. Occasionally, the memories of our early confusion and hesitance surfaced, small pangs of anxiety or regret, but they no longer held the power to unsettle me. Instead, they reminded me of how far we had come, of the bridges we had built across doubt and hesitation, and of the strength that blossoms when two hearts choose to navigate uncertainty together. As the days continued, I felt the quiet freedom of emotional clarity settle over me, the ability to hold both the mystery of life and the assurance of love simultaneously, knowing that even without complete understanding, a deep connection and the presence of shared care can provide enduring comfort. The city continued its hum around us, oblivious to the intimate, transformative work unfolding in small spaces and quiet conversations. And yet, within the cocoon of our mutual presence, I felt the profound fulfillment of hearts that had learned to trust one another, to honor each story,
and to embrace each moment without the compulsive need for full explanation. It was in this gentle acceptance, the unspoken respect for both the known and the unknown, that I discovered what it truly means to be alive, attentive, open, compassionate, and ready to meet whatever comes next with steady grace. In the quiet months that followed, Daniel and I continued our journey with a sense of calm confidence, understanding that life's deepest truths are often less about discovery and more about presence, connection, and shared courage. And I felt a gentle pride in how far we had both come emotionally, having learned to embrace uncertainty without losing ourselves. Each morning carried a renewed sense of gratitude for small routines, for warm sunlight on familiar walls, for conversations that no longer trembled with hesitation, and for the comfort of knowing that honesty and patience had woven a protective, nurturing layer around our hearts. We laughed more freely, shared more openly, and allowed our bond to deepen naturally, appreciating that love and companionship need not always be dramatic or sensational to be profound. Sometimes, their power lies in consistency, attentiveness, and trust. Occasionally, fleeting memories of past confusion or longing would appear, but they no longer unsettled me. They were gentle reminders of growth, of resilience, and of the strength that emerges when two people choose to meet vulnerability with compassion rather than fear. I came to understand that resolution is not always a single event, but a series of mindful, compassionate steps taken together, and that emotional healing flourishes most fully when nurtured with patience, empathy, and a willingness to be present without expectation. Walking beside Daniel through familiar streets, feeling the soft cadence of shared breaths, I realized that the journey itself, the courage to face uncertainty, the willingness to speak openly, the commitment to remain connected even when the path ahead was unclear, had given me something far more enduring than any singular revelation could. A sense of peace, rooted in love, trust, and mutual respect. As the seasons shifted and light played differently across the walls of my home, I embraced a subtle, abiding lesson. Life's mysteries do not diminish us when faced with courage, nor does incomplete knowledge lessen the beauty of companionship, and that the heart's true strength is measured not by the certainty it holds, but by the grace with which it navigates the unknown alongside those who matter most. And so, as the sun set softly each evening, painting the sky in gentle hues, Daniel and I continued forward together, not seeking perfect clarity, not demanding answers, but savoring the quiet joy of shared presence, understanding that this simple, steadfast companionship, nurtured through empathy, patience, and trust, is the most profound and lasting resolution of all.
Looking back now, long after the moments of uncertainty and discovery have passed, I realize that the journey itself became more important than any answers I could have hoped to find. Life has a quiet way of teaching us that clarity is not always a destination, but a process, one that unfolds in the spaces between patience, courage, and connection. Daniel and I continue to walk through our days side by side, not defined by the mysteries that remain, but by the strength of the bond we have cultivated together, a bond rooted in honesty, empathy, and the willingness to meet life's challenges with an open heart. Even the smallest gestures, a shared smile over morning coffee, the comfort of a hand held in silence, a knowing glance when words fall short, have grown into profound reminders that human connection can heal, nurture, and transform in ways that far exceed any single discovery or truth. I have learned to embrace life's uncertainties with grace, to allow the unanswered questions to exist alongside love, and to recognize that belonging is not always about origin or history, but about presence, care, and mutual respect. Each day carries new possibilities, but the calm I feel now comes not from expecting perfection or resolution, but from understanding that life's deepest joys often lie in simply being present, in cultivating kindness, and in opening our hearts fully to those we choose to walk beside. As I sit quietly, reflecting on how far we've come, I am filled with gratitude for the lessons learned, for the patience that guided us, and for the enduring proof that even in the face of uncertainty, love, understanding, and compassion can flourish. And in that quiet knowing, I feel a lasting sense of peace, the kind of peace that comes from walking life's unpredictable path with courage, heart, and the comfort of companionship, ready to embrace whatever comes next with unwavering hope.